The parish priest was supposed to take the axe that was in the car, hit Anatol on the head with the axe, and when he saw that he was lying down, he took a can of gasoline and poured it over him.
You come home after a hard day at work, or you know you have exams coming up and you're in for an all-nighter, so you take a sip. An energy drink, and this one tastes like battery fluid. Let's be honest, most energy drinks unfortunately don't taste very good, but it doesn't have to be that way. Holy is a drink that combines great taste with no guilt. You can choose from over 20 NRG flavors as well as 10 iced tea flavors and 10 hydration flavors, which are isotonic drinks. You can choose what you need at the moment: stimulation, refreshment, or hydration. And what about feeling guilty? Holy has zero sugar, taurine, aspartame, artificial colors, and flavors. It has only 20 kilocalories per serving and is full of vitamins. It's a more conscious alternative to traditional energy drinks or overly sweetened beverages, and the best part is, Holy comes in powder form. Just pour it into water, stir, and it's ready. One can contains up to 50 servings, and after the discount, one drink costs about 3 zlotys. Simple, convenient, and cheaper. To start, you can get a starter pack with flavors of your choice and test which one you like, and only then you can decide on a big can. In my starter pack, I also got this great shaker. Holy? Okay. But what if you don't like the taste? If Holy doesn't suit you, don't worry. Holy offers a 30-day money-back guarantee with no questions asked. If you use less than 10% of the product, so for example, 2 sachets with the code PATROL, you get a 10% discount. Click the link in the description below the video and check out the offer. And most importantly, let me know which Holy flavor you like. And really, believe me, it's delicious. This video is sponsored by Holy. Hi.
Welcome to another episode of ours. Well, this is an episode that surprised us a bit again. Maybe not the episode itself, but of course the story that happened. During the holidays, we tried to go back to some older topics, also with the main idea of keeping things safe during the holidays. And here comes another, so to speak, surprise. You just can't pass by this case indifferently. Recently, we've had plenty of cases that shocked us, like the case where a police officer killed his family, and then we had the case with the prison guards. One also killed members of his own family, another killed a doctor in Krakow. We had a story just as shocking about a student who practically decapitated a woman who worked at the university. Yes, a lot of these kinds of surprising, so to speak, stories. And it seemed like not much could surprise us anymore, but this story, at least for me, was really surprising. This is, of course, the story of the parish priest, the priest from the parish of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in Przypki in the Tarczyn municipality. Yes. Mirosław M., a 60-year-old parish priest. Unfortunately, he became so famous that all of Poland was talking about him. Well, this small unknown town also got noticed in this tragic, I would say, way. So I would say this: it's something that surprises us, something that seems impossible, something that's beyond us. Because of that, well, it's hard not to talk about it. On a side note, I wonder what else could happen. Mirosław M., the parish priest from this parish, a 60-year-old, well, that's a priest who already has a lot of experience. Ordained as a priest in 1992, 33 years of priestly service, quite a long time. Although the town is small, not very big, it's not like the priest wasn't known. He was also known in the Warsaw community. He used to be the director of Caritas of the Archdiocese of Warsaw, so of course among priests and clergy. So he was a man who meant something. He was perceived, I would say, in a rather positive way as a good professional. He settled in the parish in Przypki 18 years ago. I think so too. If he was the director of Caritas and then went to a small parish, wasn't that a deliberate transfer? But of course, there isn't really any information about that. I would say this: there are people who speak well of him. They say he's a good priest, but there are fewer of those words. For the most part, people either don't talk about him at all, or I would say you can see they don't want to say everything, or they just speak badly, saying he wasn't a priest who was truly a good person. They said that was his way, the way he interacted with people, that he was a man with a short fuse, as they say. So he would get angry easily, was nervous, could lash out, and you could even see it from the pulpit. Some people now say that something was wrong with the priest, that he would make a scene over the smallest thing. For example, if someone touched his car right after he had washed it, or during Mass, if one of the parishioners was taking something out of her purse. She rustled around for a long time and very noticeably. He looked at her with such contempt and anger so that everyone would know and see that it was about her, so people were simply afraid of him. That's why many people were fed up with the priest, fed up with his sermons, his behavior, and simply gave up on it. In this parish, they would go to church in another parish, avoiding contact with the priest. They felt it was simply better not to cross his path even during Mass or during the sermon. The priest made it clear to them, actually saying it outright, that he was untouchable, that he knew they were reporting him, that they were doing it. These reports were signed with names and surnames. Well, it's hard to even call it a report since someone signs it with their full name when submitting these complaints, and also anonymously. And of course, these were a kind of reports. But he also said that he was untouchable, that he wasn't there to be liked, but that he was there to serve. That's why the atmosphere in the parish was tense. That's why I would say there were such frictions between the faithful and the priest. But of course, what happened definitely surprised everyone, and people, well, it would never have even crossed their minds that something like this could happen. Today, the situation is that Father Miroslav M., well, according to canon law, he has been deprived of this authority, this church authority. He cannot practice, he cannot celebrate Mass, he cannot do all the things that a priest usually does. Then, as his superiors say, he will be subjected to suspension. What does such a suspension mean? And then there's the next step, which is that the church authorities will appeal to the Apostolic See, to the Pope, with such a request to transfer Father Miroslav to the lay state, which simply means to the secular state, so he will simply be expelled from the church and will no longer be a priest. So of course, for someone who is 60 years old, for a priest who has served for 33 years, I would say it's a very tragic end. All the more so because, of course, this is just part of everything that awaits him. Because as a consequence, he also faces, I would say, human punishment, and that is simply life imprisonment. Well, in the same parish where Father Miroslav was the pastor, there was also a parishioner, Mr. Anatol. Mr. Anatol was 68 years old, and I would say things weren't going well for him, or to put it more accurately, things were going very badly for him. How do you put it? He was homeless or in a homelessness crisis. He had nowhere to live, nowhere to find shelter. However, he still had a small plot of land. I guess that was a remnant from better times. It's hard to say whether he chose this solution himself, hoping that Father Proboszcz would simply help him and he turned to him, or more likely, which seems more probable to me, that the priest suggested this solution to him. Nevertheless, both gentlemen agreed and made an arrangement that Mr. Anatol would transfer this property, this plot of land, to the priest, and in return, Father Proboszcz would take care of him for the rest of his life. This lifelong care also assumed that Mr. Anatol would have to live somewhere, but it seems that both of them understood it differently, because Anatol thought that he would be able to get the plot. Would the priest buy him an apartment in Warsaw, or maybe rent one, and in that apartment, even if it's small, he would be able to live? However, it seemed that the parish priest had completely different plans, that he wanted to place Mr. Anatol in some kind of social welfare home, that is, in a care facility, and that's how he wanted to solve the matter. Well, it was clear from the beginning that Mr. Anatol simply didn't like it, that this wasn't a solution for him. And both gentlemen, well, had known each other for a long time because they had known each other for almost a quarter of a century. That's why I would say Anatol's trust in the parish priest, who believed that the parish priest would simply fulfill this obligation. And, well, he would have a roof over his head in, I would say, fairly decent conditions. There were quite a few meetings about this apartment. They met many times, and many times they couldn't reach any kind of agreement. They just couldn't come to an understanding because they had different opinions. I said it, and that's how it was. On July 24th, on Thursday, they arranged another meeting like this. Mr. Anatol was supposed to come to the parish priest. They were going to talk about it again and try to reach some kind of consensus. Well, on the same day, except that it was already around 10 p.m., a certain man was riding a bicycle. This is a place called La Sapole. I would say, as the name suggests, it's either a field or a forest and nothing else. Yes, that's more or less how it is. It's an area that's not very frequented. Not many people go there, especially at that hour. There aren't many people riding there, so it was pure coincidence and luck that this man was even riding his bike there. At some point while riding, he sees that something is burning in the middle of the road. Surprised, he rode closer, and at that moment, as he was approaching, he also saw that suddenly an off-road vehicle, which had been parked on the roadside near the place where the fire was, started moving. And that car, simply without turning on the lights, drove away consciously. That man wrote down or remembered the license plate number of the car. He also wrote down the make of the car, and then he saw it here with horror. Something that's burning is simply a human body. He tried to put it out, but there wasn't much he could do in that situation because the fire was big. He called all the necessary services, especially the ambulance. The ambulance arrived fairly quickly, but the man who was burning was taken to the hospital and they started fighting for his life. But unfortunately, the man died. An autopsy. I would say it was terrifying, especially because it looked like this man was set on fire while he was still alive, that someone deliberately set him on fire knowing he was alive. When he died, of course, the body was taken for an autopsy. The doctor noticed. He stated that the direct cause of this man's death was bodily injuries. These injuries were caused by fire, as 80% of his body was burned or scorched. However, this man also had wounds, a contused wound on his head, inflicted by something both hard and with a sharp edge. Well, of course, in Polish conditions, you can immediately guess that it was simply an axe. And yes, the doctor stated that probably this man was first stunned with an axe and then set on fire, doused with something flammable. You can also guess that it was simply gasoline and he was set on fire. A terrible death in horrible agony, really something cruel and terrifying. Here, a group of police officers arrived at the scene, the prosecutor showed up and the inspection began. Besides that body, which had already been taken from the scene, it also looks like it was simply thrown into the fire. At the time when this man was burning, there was also a charred axe, so it could be assumed that he was struck with that axe. There was also a canister, probably one that had previously contained gasoline. Matches were also found, and from what I know, they also found a shoe and a set of false teeth. It seemed after the inspection, of course, that this whole tragedy took place on the road, that the man was struck there and then set on fire. It was assumed, because it looked like it could be the case, that the body was set on fire. All those things were thrown in to cover up the traces of the crime. Thanks to the fact that there was that cyclist there and that he remembered all the details about the car so clearly, there were no problems at all with identifying the owner of the vehicle. And quite quickly the police arrived at the scene, that is, at the rectory where Father Miroslav lived. Specifically, it was the anti-terrorist unit, or more accurately the counter-terrorist unit as it's called today, that showed up. Well, that's also because there was information that the priest might simply have a weapon. That's why the anti-terrorist unit was on the scene, and they detained the priest along with the police officers, of course, right away from the priest's car. It looked like only he had been driving it that evening. He was taken to the police station for questioning. And basically the parish priest immediately confessed. He talked a lot and explained things. Well, and he said more or less in this way, that on that day he had arranged to meet with Mr. Anatol for another sensitive conversation about that apartment. Well, they started arguing at his rectory, and at some point it took a bad turn. You also remember that the parishioner said the priest has a short fuse, meaning he gets irritated easily, gets nervous easily, and it's easy to throw him off balance. So we can imagine Mr. Anatol, probably also being in a homelessness crisis, likely wanted to get something more out of life. So it's definitely true that this conversation wasn't easy. As the parish priest said, he wanted to ease the atmosphere of the conversation a bit, so at some point he suggested they just take a ride in the car, that maybe if they drove around the conversation would take on a different pace, that they'd try to come to an understanding, and indeed they set off on the road. It was a coincidence that he ended up in that particular town near Grojek. But as they were driving in the car, they kept arguing. The argument was fierce. They couldn't agree on anything, and nothing suggested that they would reach any kind of understanding. They stopped on the road and got out of the car. When the quarrel escalated, Father Proboszcz was said to have taken an axe from the car, struck Anatol on the head with it, and when he saw him lying there, he took a canister of gasoline and poured it over him. And then, simply seeing what was happening, maybe also seeing that cyclist, he just drove away and fled. The prosecutor's office, of course, pressed charges against Father Proboszcz. These are charges, in light of everything we know today, of murder with particular cruelty. Of course, as well, theoretically he faces life imprisonment, but in my opinion it didn't necessarily have to be that way, meaning the course of the murder itself. Presumably yes, but the priest says he did it somewhat in the heat of the moment, that it wasn't planned. However, in my opinion, first of all, they drove into such a remote place, and it was pure coincidence that the cyclist appeared there. On top of that, the priest had an axe, a canister of gasoline, and matches in the car. I don't know if that's standard equipment for priests in Poland, but I don't think so. Of course, I'm saying this sarcastically, but as you can see, it looks like all of this was somehow planned or planned in advance. And that was the last chance conversation in the heat of all this, looking at the personality of Father Proboszcz. He simply put all those things together and invited Anatol for one last ride, also planning that this is exactly how it would end. It's just possible that he planned it either earlier, or that he came up with it that very evening when they talked for the last time. I'm saying this because nowhere in these media reports does such a version, such a possibility appear. And in my opinion, now that Father Proboszcz just thought it all through, he has something to fight for, because the range of punishment he could get is very wide, from 15 years to life, and as you know, recently it's been life without parole. With this kind of crime, it seems very likely to me that this is exactly the kind of sentence that will be handed down. In my opinion, the fact that the body was set on fire doesn't necessarily mean that the priest was thinking about covering up the evidence. As you remember, the parishioners said about him that the priest was like a king, that he carried himself that way, that he was that kind of ruler. And also in Christian symbolism, I would say fire has such a symbolic meaning. On one hand, of course, it has a positive meaning, but also those who are interested in this know that fire in the symbolism of the church represents a kind of God's wrath and justice. Well, you remember Sodom and Gomorrah, that it was actually a rain of fire from God, those two cities. And since the priest considered himself a king, maybe he aimed even higher. Well, what I'm getting at, of course, is that the priest will certainly undergo psychiatric evaluation, that he will be examined by psychologists. However, when it comes to the possibility of some kind of disorders being involved and the cause of this crime, these are obviously two different things, and there may be some kind of disorders. But of course, this does not affect the charges, nor does it affect the sentence later on. What matters is that at the moment of committing such a crime, he was aware of what he was doing, and it seems that the priest simply had that awareness. Well, I also think, just as a side note, that the priest won't have it easy in prison either. That simply put, the prison guards will have to keep an eye on him. Of course, most prisoners aren't really practicing, but many of them consider themselves or declare themselves to be believers. Well, his act, the murder of a homeless man under such circumstances, will definitely bring the priest a lot of negative, let's say, opinions about him. But also, realistically, as I said, they had to keep watch, and as I mentioned, the investigation is just beginning. We'll see how it goes. Well, it looks like the plot of land in question, that property, simply belonged to the priest. Maybe Anatol was thinking about it, and that was his attitude too, that by transferring it to the priest, he was actually transferring it to the church. But of course, those are two different things. The version that it was a planned murder also seems highly probable to me, but either way, a parish priest murdering a parishioner in such a way, I don't think that's ever happened in criminal records before, at least I've never come across it anywhere. And that's all for this rather extraordinary episode, I would say. But as is usually the case in our stories, when something happens that just overwhelms us, we always try to give some commentary here, and that's it. Of course, subscribe to us, and of course, take care.